Bungie is giving out massive details about Strand in this interview. This one's pretty crazy. It's going to be the highest APM class we've ever seen, and that's actions per minute. So it's going to be a very active, very wild class Strand, and I'm kind of looking forward to it. It looks like this interview is going to make Strand pretty strong and pretty crazy and unique to Destiny 2, something we've never really seen. We're into the final straight before Destiny 2. Lightfall launches and Bungie is firing off new information, frankly, at a high, bewildering rate. Today is the return of Strand, which is the new damage type to be added. As such, it comes with 3 new subclasses, which the developer has broken down in detail on its site, along with the trailer embedded above. I was given a preview of the stuff last week and a chance to talk with design lead Kevin Yanes and feature Eric Smith and put questions about Strand and ability design to them. It was a wide-ranging discussion, taking in everything from actual power fantasy of Strand is through how to buff roaming supers and how, most incredibly, why we will not be transforming into giant egg-spewing spiders anytime soon, although that would be crazy, right? Strand will be easier to unlock than Stasis, so I can give you the TLDR. And basically, you had to unlock Stasis on all 3 characters, and it was very lengthy grind. Thankfully, they're going to make it much more expedited, so happy about that. Then it says, you can also expect more aspects and fragments to be released as a part of the seasonal model over the course of 2023. By the end of the year, you're going to have a complete subclass kit that will be able to stand toe-to-toe with your existing suite of powers and speak to a playstyle you currently don't have, says Yanes. My takeaway is that although it does sound like you'll need to play the campaign on each character to unlock Strand, you're going to have more freedom to choose what you unlock, and it should feel less laborious. Certainly, I don't expect to be doing the equivalent of schlepping around the map shooting crystals with Salvation's Grip this time around. It's pretty funny. Strand is the high APM class. I have to confess that before the interview, I didn't totally get the power fantasy of Strand. Beyond the obvious appeal of Spider-Man enjoyers, where it clicks for me is when Kevin Yanes and Smith start talking about how Strand is the high APM or actions per minute class. Bungie wanted Strand to play completely differently to the light subclasses and Stasis, which already offered a bunch of different ways to melt monsters and control crowds, mobs respectively. They needed to find a different role for Strand. We almost stumbled into the APM idea. We almost accidentally stumbled into the APM idea, says Yanes. We found it, embraced it, and kept going. The key is it's really easy to get to the start and messing around with Strand and have fun, but it has the depth to reward people who explore. Things like grabbing a tangle and throwing it and then grappling to the same tangle and following up with a grapple punch. That's something you cannot do with any other subclass. But when you string those actions together, you feel like a god. Very interesting. Tangles are like the Warmind cell replacement. So what they did was they deprecated Warmind cells, and then they've basically replaced part of that element with the tangles that you'll be getting now. So keep that in mind. Strand is the first subclass to grant 3 melees. I remember triple melee charges being leaked back in August last year. Before we even knew the subclass was Strand, historically we tend not to give players 3 melee charges by default, says Smith. And Titan and Warlock, we give them 3. The Titan's melee sends you forward considerable distance, so you'll be able to close the gap pretty easily by chaining 3 melees together. The speed at which you can move because of that is really high. Mobility and arrow play will be core to all the Strand subclasses, but Hunters will be the ones permanently up in the rafters. Oh god. So look forward to that. It looks like the Titan melee will knock you back and have crazy mobility, but the Hunters are going to be literally flying around the air like Spider-Man. This is going to be a crazy time to be a Destiny Guardian, that's for sure. Bungie expects Hunters to create their own grapple arenas. Theoretically, Hunters have always been the high agility class, so it's no surprise that Threadrunner goes hardest with the grapple ability. Hunter has this aspect called Widow Silk that creates a grapple tangle at the point of impact, explains Smith. Not only does Widow Silk create the grapple tangles, but it also gives me 2 grapple charges. So I can grapple once to create this point, and then if I grapple to that point again using my second charge or my teammate grapples to it, it won't cost any grapple energy. If we create a chain of grapple tangles, we can all grapple for free and cover a huge distance. Oh god. Oh, god. That's going to be crazy. Grapple tangles also negate the 5-second lockdown that otherwise prevents Hunters from using both charges back to back. As for why there's a lockout at all, Yanes explains the team's philosophy regarding the movement abilities. We really like expressive movement, Icarus Dash, Shiver Strike, Cryoclasm Thruster. One of the things we pay a lot of attention to is what the uptime of that movement looks like. Grapple is super expressive, and we absolutely want to have the ability to displace yourself, but you've got to make sure you're managing your ability energy economy. He says that by chaining grapple tangles, his team has been able to get halfway across the King's Fall ship section. Excuse me? That's crazy. A carefully set up team can probably do some nonsensical things and end your frustration with some of the jumping puzzles, Bungie doesn't want to go back and re-author old locations to add explicit grapple opportunities, though, because they want players to feel like they're almost cheating with their mastery of Strand. Both developers expect to see a ton of emergent gameplay as their players experiment with Strand kit, especially the grapple. For us, that sort of functionality is a little bit scary to put into the game like Destiny, but that's where we want to be, says Smith. We want to be slightly scared of the things we're making, because otherwise we're not pushing the envelope. I like that, actually. Yanes agrees and gives an example of how he saved a falling teammate by throwing out a tangle for them to grapple. Novel interactions are the depth I'm talking about, where people start to experiment with the sandbox we've made and discover new cases. Some that we guarantee are not intended. That's a successful sandbox right there. Here are the tools, here are the rules, Godspeed and good luck. Grapple isn't just about mobility, it's a powerful offensive tool. Getting the tuning of grapple ability right sounds like one of the hardest parts of developing Strand. We wanted the grapple to be able to read the player's mind a bit, says Smith. We also wanted it to be usable by all classes, which means it had to take up your grenade slot, which means it had to be as powerful as other grenades in a combat situation. To remedy that, we added the grapple punch, where you press the melee button while grappling, and you do this powered up third-person punch that does AoE damage and debuffs enemies. Very nice. Hunters also have a particularly cool ability when using their ensnaring slam aspect that sees them do a gainer backflip before diving to the ground, suspending any nearby enemies and any nearby dudes. Again, it's easy to envision how cool that's going to be when strung together with grapples. Critical to understanding how grappling works in Destiny 2 is that you don't need to attach your rope to a surface. It's very versatile, very easy to use, says Smith. When I decide to grapple, all I have to do is point in the direction and hit the button. If the grapple can't reach a surface, it's going to anchor to a point in space and pull me in that direction. I don't have to determine whether I'm in range of a surface to attach to. It's always just going to work, whether there's something there or not. That's awesome. For Gains, one of the biggest problems with grappling and other shooters is that depth perception is awful unless you're a savant. So Bungie's solution was to do away with any need to judge distance entirely. You just hit the button and fly. That's awesome. Bungie really hopes Strand isn't going to be a huge nightmare in PvP. Obviously, we all remember what happened last time Destiny 2 got a new subclass. Stasis shipped with a 5-second stun in PvP, says Smith, with a rueful smile. It was a hard crowd control. You got frozen and couldn't really fight back. Wanted to avoid that. When you get suspended with Strand in PvP, you'll still have some movement control. You can fight back by shooting in hip fire, and it doesn't feel as helpless when you get hit with the suspend debuff. Smith says that one of the big problems with making a whole new damage type and associated subclass is that Bungie is trying to build a box at the same time as deciding what we should go in it. That can make it hard to foresee the outcomes. Got it? Hopefully it's not busted for PvP. We're totally fine saying stasis is the domain of the hard stun, where as Strand, we attacked it as more of a root initially and then iterated, says Yanes. We wanted to come up with something clever enough to make you feel like Spider-Man while you're playing in Neomuna, but in PvP not make somebody want to toss their controller. He also hopes that Strand won't be the only dominant flavor in PvP when Lightfall launches, but conceded that it may still be just because it's the new hotness and players will be excited. We're pretty happy with how it's playing right now. Ask us in 4 weeks and maybe that answer is different. All right, roaming supers are going to get a buff. Interesting. Supers in Destiny generally fall into two camps: massive burst damage or running around hitting stuff. There are notable exceptions like Well of Radiance and Word of Dawn, both of which offer utility in the form of damage buffs and healing. Generally, players gravitate to whatever does the most damage and quickest. Having seen some disappointment that the Titan's Strand Super is a roaming variant, I want to know whether it's becoming harder to find new design space for supers. Both Yanes and Smith think there's plenty of room to explore. A lot of our supers right now are melt dudes in fantastic fashion, and there's total validity to the apex power expression, says Yanes. But one of the things we tried to do, especially on the Darkness subclass, is find a different avenue. Yanes cites how Stasis and the Strand subclasses lean into using their respective keywords to create new kinds of super. You can see that philosophy at work with the Titan Blade Fury Super, which has 2 attacks, both of which use Strand verbs. Smith explains the light attack is a melee which you can chain infinitely, and the heavy attack is a projectile that comes out and suspends enemies on impact. So it is a roaming super, but allows me to hold enemies in place and then close the gap really quickly. Note that those light attacks increase in speed as you land them, and they also sever enemies, lowering their damage output. Nice. That should help with survivability, which has been a perennial issue with roaming supers in harder content. Speaking more philosophically, says Yanes, The team has plans for roaming supers and PvE to slot them into a more compelling roles versus one-off supers. They can't go into detail yet, but Smith mentions that they're looking at a damage output and orb generation as the areas for improvement. Interesting. Interesting. So some big adjustments to roaming supers coming soon. It sounds like a nerf is coming for Well of Radiance. Uh-oh. It's clear that Bungie doesn't want to just create supers that do more and more damage. We're trying to brace the community for a place where there are different mechanical outputs for supers, says Yanes. We're going to start playing with that more as time goes on. So you're going to see less variations of it just murders everything and a lot more variations of it has a specific role and it applies to our team composition. He acknowledges that the danger when designing a utility-based super is threading the needle between making it useful enough, but not so useful that you feel like you have to equip it in every encounter until the end of time. The obvious example being Warlock's Well of Radiance. That's probably in the realm of too useful, says Yanes, with that kind of twinkle in his eye that suggests that it's going to be nerfed sooner rather than later. Oh no. Well, nerf. Alright, the Warlock Broodweaver super was going to turn you into an actual goddamn spider at one point. Here's a wild one, normally asking the question, what kind of crazy stuff did you cut? Results in terrible answers because no dev wants to talk about something that didn't make it into the game, except Bungie apparently. The Warlock Broodweaver super was originally going to transform you into a giant spider that launched spider eggs and had spider babies running around instead of threadlings, says Smith. Okay, sounds amazing. Can we have that, please? Apparently not, because they're trying to transform the Warlock's bipedal model into an 8-legged creature. Required so much work that ended up being out of the scope. Also, arachnophobia is a real thing, he adds. Yanes has his own story to share. One of my favorite prototypes was an early Warlock super where you would spawn these aerial threadlings, but they were just screebs that were T-posing. They would go slowly towards the enemy and then shoot threadling eggs. So you had these 3 T-posing screebs vomiting threadlings. It was hilarious, but also horrifying. Nightmare fuel aside, the Warlock super shipping with lightfall still leans into the minion master fantasy. That sounds insane. Can you imagine your Warlock super spawns screebs T-posing? On cast, Needlestorm launches a burst of strand spikes which detonate on impact and then turn into threadlings that chase anyone left alive before exploding. Smith says that during development, it felt like a failure if Needlestorm played too much like a green version of Hunter's Blade Barrage super. That was actually a negative feedback point that we got, he says, so we decided it should be about the armada of little green dudes you're making. Got it. Warlocks get to use threadlings very differently to the other classes. Every Strand class will be able to generate threadlings, but Warlocks have what Smith describes as a special kinship with the explosive little critters. In the event that your threadlings don't find a target, they'll return to the Warlock and condense down into a form that orbits you like an Arc Soul or Child of the Old Gods. This behavior is called perching, and you can have various numbers of threadlings perched at any one time. Next time the Warlock attacks the enemy, they're going to pop off and attack it, says Smith. Very nice. Comparable to like Arc Souls. Threadlings can be generated in multiple ways depending on how your character is set up. For instance, using the Weaver's Call aspect, whenever the Warlock casts a rift, they will weave 3 threadling eggs, and that hatch when they hit a surface. Additional perch threadlings will also be converted to eggs if you aren't interested in grappling. There's also a threadling grenade. Yanes, who admits to being a Warlock main but insists that means he avoids overtuning the class, explains how it works. A totally valid behavior for Warlocks is, I'm going to consume this threadling grenade, create a full perch, and then dump it all and have my children wreak havoc. Honestly, I know I'll be playing on day one. I know what I'll be playing on day one. Very nice. Stasis was once time crystals. Interesting. Let's end on a fun one, discussing how much subclass changes during the creative iteration process. Yanes has this to share. Stasis was originally going to be time crystals. It wasn't going to be cosmic ice, but we didn't want to do the generic fantasy thing of it's frost, burr. We always want there to be a Destiny interpretation of the power, something that is uniquely our game. Solar isn't just fire, it's the power of the sun. Void isn't just black holes. We're plucking sentient creatures from the cosmos and sending them to convert life for us. But how did the team arrive at magical green ropes binding the cosmos together? We didn't want to do an explicitly damage-focused thing, says Yanes. Early on, we decided that we were going to look at combat utility. We did a lot of work on damage mitigation, lowering the damage of enemies. That got us into the headspace of severing enemies, connection to the greater world. We started getting down the idea that everyone's connected by this extra dimensional construct that is the weave. Interesting. As for the visual look of Strand, Yanes says consistency was key. We keyed off of the darkness resonance. Even on Stasis, we wanted to make sure that everything has a consistent physical language to the darkness resonance. We didn't want it to look ethereal and magical in the way that the light subclasses do. But put another way, the darkness subclasses are about physicality, and if Stasis has crystals, then Strand has strings. That started to inform the rest of the power base, says Yanes. What we can do with strings that we couldn't do before. Oh, we're going to have rope weapons. We began talking about grappling hooks. The visual started becoming clear. It's all discovery. We started from the first point of dark telekinesis, and we had a bunch of other goals that led us down another path. In my experience, you can have the plan laid out, but you need to afford yourself that room for discovery. I promise you the plan in your head will not work out the way you think it does. Very interesting. That sounds crazy. I'm very excited for this, actually. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. The highest APM class is going to be playing Destiny 2 in a way we've never really played before, especially hunters out there.